So I'm pleased as publisher to be able to take a little credit for this book that you see on the table, Life, No Work in the Grave, Life in the Toe River Valley. Got a great and generous author sitting beside me, Katey Schultz, who we'll hear from a little bit later. But right now, I'd like to just give the floor over to Jo Ann Thomas Croom for maybe 5 or 10 minutes to introduce us. I think you've got some comments to make in general, Jo Ann, and then you want to. Katey, it turns out that Katey's novel and short stories have to do with the war in Afghanistan, and in fact, war plays a part at various times in Jo Ann Thomas Croom's book. So I'd like to hear a little bit about that as well as your introductory comments, Jo Ann.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you for coming. And I owe a debt of gratitude to many people in this audience, to Maggie Powell, to Brian Knott, and to my family. So thank you very much. I like to start by looking at who, what, where, when, and why. I think that will be probably the easiest thing to do. This is the story of one family through about 5 generations who were living in the Toe River Valley in Mitchell and Yancey County, just up the ridge from Asheville. The Toe River is sort of a smaller version of the French Broad River. The French Broad is an old river. The Toe River is very, very old. And there's a lot of cute comments that we used to get growing up there when people would come in and say, "How did you get that crazy name, the Toe River?" Well, it came from an Indian legend tale. Whether or not it's true, I do not know. But the Indians would use the area where I grew up as a hunting ground, evidently, before white settlers came in. And various tribes would come and they would have sort of like grand hunting vacation hoopla, and it was a chance to get acquainted with other people. Well, there was a beautiful Indian maiden named Estatoa who met a brave from either the Catawba or another tribe. They clicked, and she had agreed to run off with him to his tribe and abandon her own tribe. The braves in her tribe found out about that, said, "No way, Jose." So they caught them both, killed the lover, and she, in a fit of grief, threw herself off the cliff and drowned in the Toe River. But the Indians always named it the Estatoa or the Estatoa River. But growing up there, I learned some history of the 5 or 6 generations that had been there since my family came. My uncle and my dad were both educators and historians, and they wrote everything down so that when they died, they left me boxes and boxes of journals to go through and to read and to see if I could glean anything about what was going on at that time. Well, the history of the region from the white perspective was that the British had closed off Western North Carolina to everyone except the Indians. Only the Indians could use it, and that kept some tranquility in the region. So the Revolutionary War came, and the Indians unfortunately chose the wrong side. They went with the British. They lost. And so the North Carolina state then opened up the region to settlement. And fortunately for one part of the family, the silver part of the family, my grandmother was silver, they had managed to be, my great-great-great-great-grandfather had been a soldier in the Revolution on the side of the revolutionary people and had been actually served with Washington's army. He and his son both did that, and he was awarded a land grant, which was a mile square. That's a big piece of property. That's over 600 acres of land. He came down and finally got around to trying to find out where it was. His son actually made the jaunt to the Tow River, staked it out, and they finally got it legally registered in 1808 when they had built a log home there that is still standing. It's the oldest home in Mitchell County, and it still is there and looks in almost livable shape. So they settled there, and they had a big advantage. Number one, they could choose the land they wanted. And number two, they chose land that was just rolling hills, not the steep mountain slopes that surrounded the area. If you are going to be a subsistence farmer, you want land that you can manage without having erosion wash all your topsoil down. They also prospered because they had large families. If you want a workforce, the easiest way to get that workforce is probably to procreate and have strong sons. And then you could parcel out to them if they perform adequately. You could parcel out to them some of the land, but that's a losing game. Because if you give land away, that means you have less land available for farming. So over the generations, that became less feasible to be a subsistence farmer. But there were other people here too as well. And the other people included the Thomas family, which didn't have any service that would give them a land grant. They didn't have any money. And why they came here was probably to be tenant farmers and to live off the commons. Now, the commons was a piece of land that had not yet been claimed. That means you could hunt on it, you could fish near it, you could collect nuts and whatever you could. And so people would manage to live, but it was a hard life that they lived as tenant farmers. One of the sons of the original silver settler fought in the Mexican War, but the next war that really ravaged the area and caused a lot of damage was the Civil War. And there were two sides to the family of my grandparents. My grandmother was Maggie Silver. My grandfather was Aaron Thomas. Maggie Silver came from the big log house. Aaron Thomas came from the tenant side of the river. And he had a hard time. He, in comparison to my grandmother, was very uneducated. He could write one thing, he could write his name, A.H. Thomas. She, on the other hand, could read and write very well because her grandmother had taught her a lesson every Sunday afternoon. And she had learned how to read and write and was pretty well educated for that time and place. When they got married, it was at the end of the Civil War and times were very, very tough. And the land was less farmable. They had to leave, and they worked on the railroad camps, and she picked ginseng and galax to sell in the Commons area, and he worked on building the railroad. And they did that for several years and then got enough money saved to come back to the Tow River area and build a small house on a small piece of land. And there they had 7 children. And the 7 children varied considerably in the amount of education they could have. Some had very little, but some were, like my dad and his brother, were able to do better because they were able to attend in Burnsville the Yancey Collegiate Institute. That's a big word. It was a Baptist school, and the Presbyterians also had a school. It seemed that there was some rivalry between the different Protestant denominations for being able to educate these poor mountain people. But that's what happened to the family. So the who is the family, the what is the story of their lives that changed so dramatically. There were coal fields in Virginia and Tennessee. There were factories and plants that were being built in the Piedmont of North and South Carolina. How to get the coal from there to South Carolina? Easiest thing is build a railroad. So they built a railroad along the river. And in that opening up of the region, life changed forever. Subsistence farming was no longer a very viable way to live. The timber went first, then the mining industry. And so it was a long, hard slog for them. And this book is the story of how they survived the challenges that confronted them and of the troubles they had along the way. Just to give you an example, typhoid fever killed my great-grandfather on the day that my grandmother had her youngest son. Typhoid fever was very common. There was no treatment for that. My uncle had osteomyelitis as a result of having typhoid fever and then getting injured in a playground tussle. And so he became what he called a cripple. He had been the one who had gone first to the Yancey Collegiate Institute, and he had earned enough credit and educational experience there so that he started teaching when he was healthy in a one-room school where he was the teacher and the janitor and whatever. And when my dad went to that same Yancey Collegiate Institute, he found that education was a way out for him too, a way to survive.
Jo Ann, so basically you've just described the two major contributors to the book. Your uncle Monroe, invalid, he had time to observe and write his journals, and your father Walter, who then, after superintendent, he published a lot of reminiscences in the local paper.
Yeah, he liked to write. I don't understand that, but
well, we'll come back to that. But I'd like to bring Katey in as well, because talk about troubles and how you meet challenges. The Afghanistan war, if you think about it, it's nothing but challenge in a way. And Katey lives in Silo, the Toe River Valley, and at some point I'd like to ask her about her journey in her life to North Carolina and Silo. But first, I'd just like to ask kind of how the idea of the novel Still Come Home came to you.
Sure. Yeah. I'm going to cheat though and just respond a little.
Yeah, sure.
Just first to say, it is so amazing to be in a bookstore with readers and publishers and booksellers. So thank you for making this possible. It's been a while. And every month in Silo, every August, we have a delightful production called Festatoa, which is a weekend-long festival which involves a rock opera reenactment of part of the story that you told. So you might look for an invite to that.
Thank you.
But it was really lovely to hear your connections. So this novel has three main characters. Nathan Miller, who is a National Guardsman, but who's on his fourth tour in Afghanistan, and Asaya, who is a 17-year-old Afghan girl living in a remote village, and her husband by arranged marriage, who's 40, and his name is Rahim. And he's a reluctant sort of side gig worker for the Taliban, who you really want to hate, and I worked really hard to try and not let people hate him. So these were three characters who I first made up when I was writing my collection of short stories, Flashes of War, for individual pieces. And they just wouldn't leave me alone when I finished that book, the way that an imagination can sort of get hooked. I saw, although Asaya and Rahim are in one story and Nathan's in this other story, in my mind's eye, when I was done with Flashes of War, I didn't have a publishing contract for it yet, but I had moved on. In my mind's eye, I could see the three of them meeting in a road, almost like a standoff, facing each other. And I saw it like as clearly as I could pull to mind a photo in a family photo album. Like I just knew it, like on a cellular level. It was so familiar and believable. And that was in 2012. And I spent 6 years writing my way toward making that moment true, pretty much. And then not too long, or kind of in the middle of that, my son was born like a month after. Anyway, it was all very blurry at that point, but thankfully I got enough of it done so that after his birth I could not write about war for a while, after having really enmeshed myself in research and war writing for 8 years.
Where were you physically at that point?
I was all over the place, all over the place. I wrote flashes of war while spending 31 out of 36 months all over the United States in various writing residencies. That was wild. And then I started drafting Still Come Home during the tail end of that. Like Nathan like came to me on this dude ranch in Texas, way, way, way far away from anything that I would ever call familiar. It was a very fascinating landscape. 1,700 acres and wild boar and the groundskeeper and me for a month. It was pretty lonely and interesting, but I made up Nathan that. And then the novel was written in kind of between Sealand, North Carolina, Scott County, Virginia, near the Carter Fold, and Alaska.
It's a great story, and there's some of the issues of the veteran and the person who's been in war, and what that does to a person, and what that does to a person's life partner, spouse, and Jo Ann, I think since No Work in the Grave is about so many things. It includes some war issues and veteran type issues, right?
It does. My oldest uncle was named Casson, and he had dropped out of school to worked on the railroad, and then he got drafted. And when he got drafted, my dad said it was the first time he ever heard his mother pray out loud, and her hair turned white within a very short period of time. She was so worried about him. He was shipped abroad, went to France, and probably was gassed, as best we can tell. He came back with severe damage to his lungs. But when he came back home and lived at home for a brief period of time, the inevitable conflict between the young male and the old male, the papa bear and the cub who's feeling his oats too, began to emerge, and Casson had difficulty in getting up to go to work. And
Can I read that passage?
Please do.
Casson, this is World War I. Casson had been home only a few months from his military service in World War I when trouble began to brew with Pa. Casson had returned from overseas in the peak of physical health. After loafing about for a few weeks, he had resumed working on the CC&O. That's the Clinchfield, Cleveland, Clinchfield in Ohio. Yeah. As a section hand. It soon became apparent that he and Pa were on a collision course. Casson seemed never to be able to establish a reasonable time for bedtime at night. He liked to roam around with his friends at night. And as a usual practice, he would go to bed long after most had gone to bed for the night. When morning came, breakfast was ready, and it was time for him to get up and get ready to go to his job. But he would be sleeping so soundly that it was almost impossible to wake him. Pa, now this is the fellow who signed his name A.H. Pa would call him, no response. He would call a second time, still no response. At last, in a rage, he would storm into the bedroom. Casson would finally rouse himself and come to breakfast in an ugly mood. And almost invariably, he and Pa would end up by having an argument at the breakfast table. On one morning, this state of affairs came to a culmination when after having called 2 or 3 times with the usual lack of response, Pa went into the bedroom and with much effort dragged Casson's trunk containing most of his prized possessions from the bedroom to the porch. After all these intervening years, I can still see Pa tugging that trunk through the door, and I can still hear the scraping noise as it was dragged across the floor. So that's your uncle. No, that's your father, Walter.
Recited that. It's mealtime was fairly short because there was a limited amount of food, so they all ate very rapidly, and the mealtime was the only time that they all gathered together, and it was the time where differences were often aired. So needless to say, several of them as adults developed ulcers and difficulties with the digestive tract. So not good.
So I promised Katey that I was going to ask you what was your journey then from places like Texas and the wild boar to North Carolina and CeeLo?
Yeah, this is the year where I'm in my 40s. This is the year where I have been half my life in North Carolina and half in Portland, Oregon, where I'm from originally. But the half in North Carolina involved, like, for example, leaving for 31 out of 36 months here and there. So I moved here to Yancey County in CeeLo, in the Salto River Valley in 2002 to teach at the Arthur Morgan School, which is like a Quaker Montessori-based farm school, boarding school for teenagers. So that's what got me here. And I taught there for 3 years, and then I moved across the river and I bartered rent to live in an off-the-grid cabin and apply to grad school for writing.
Nice. So your writing career really grew and came to fruition while you were in Western North Carolina.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's wow, what a literary family to get to be a part of.
Wow.
So really lucky.
So Katey, you're sort of I guess you would be in the big category of transplant, even though it's been a long time.
From away,
right.
Off.
And Wilma Dykeman was, for whom the Dykeman Legacy Press's name was half transplant, half native. Her mother was a descendant of original Western North Carolina pioneers, Yancey County and North Buncombe County. And then her father was originally from upstate New York. How many people here in person here were born or grew up outside of Western North Carolina? Yeah, most people. There are a few who have their hands not raised, but transplants are wonderful. We welcome them, and Asheville is a wonderfully diverse place because of it, and Western North Carolina. Jo Ann, you are not a transplant. So
I'm a native.
So speaking as a native, how did writing this book kind of affect you, or maybe change your perspectives on some things? You were writing about stuff so close to you and so close to your life, but writing a book is no easy task. And I hear through the grapevine that you spent 5 to 6 years on this book. So did you change it all?
Probably, and I think I learned to understand a little bit better about some of the silences that had followed questions that I would ask my parents. There were no African Americans in Mitchell County when I grew up. 0. I knew there were some. We would come to Asheville on shopping trips for school clothes, and I did see people who were African American, and there were some in Burnsville at a small enclave there. I asked once why that had happened, and there was silence. And it turned out that there was more to the story than one might have imagined. And part of it came from the time when large companies were coming in and bringing in work crews from Italian immigrants sometimes, but also sometimes as a way to utilize people who were in jail or prison in North Carolina as laborers, cheap labor. And in one of those cases, a laborer, a convict had escaped from the work crew and was accused of raping an elderly woman in the community. The word went out and that convict was recaptured. He was captured and taken summarily to the county seat, tried within 2 or 3 days, sentenced, and then he was sent to Raleigh to the state prison and was eventually executed there. He had, his history supported a bit the charge that had been brought against him, but the process was certainly most unfair. And the word had gone out, I'm sure, through the African community, African-American community, that this was not a safe place to be. There are still very few African-Americans in Mitchell County. And it turned out that there was even a quirkier part of that. I had no idea that my grandfather Thomas's brother was married to the woman who had accused the convict of raping her. And Aunt Alice was not mentioned much in any conversation that was ever had that I ever heard. But it is ironic that when I lived at Kona with my grandparents for a short period of time when I was 6, my Uncle Monroe decided to teach me the first grade. He was probably bored out of his gourd just being around old people all the time. And so he taught me by writing things on one side of the ledger and I would write it on the other. I didn't learn to print until I took drafting in college. But we had this little book and he started out with family. And family was of paramount importance to the people who lived in the area, because family was where you could always get help. But sometimes there were secrets that were not shared that I only learned about later.
So you did change a little bit, yeah.
Yes.
And speaking of change and returning to the veteran issues, I'd like to turn back to Katey a little bit and talk about one of those principal characters in Still Come Home, Nathan Miller. And he's now a veteran, as you say, a National Guard with multiple tours. That leads to some tension with his wife, Penley, is it? Yeah. And maybe you could read a little bit about Nathan's state of mind.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thank you. Right. I have to ask though first. So I went through this period where I was very obsessed with the swinging footbridges. There are 13 in Mitchell and Yancey counties, and I wrote a little book, and there was like this little documentary about it.
Lundy.
Right. Yeah. So, but Kona, is it Kona potassium? It is. Okay. Potassium, oxygen,
And sodium.
Okay.
Supposedly.
Thank you. You're the person I needed to speak to like 15 years ago for that answer. All right. So we're going to go somewhere. I think what I'm reading tonight takes place in Western North Carolina. So he's not on the forward operating base in Afghanistan at this particular moment. And hopefully you could just follow along, but I wanted to read it because to me, well, I'm really, really fascinated. Sure, I write about war, but what I'm really, really interested in is the way that landscape influences culture and human behavior and human thought. And ultimately, of course, our actions. But I just feel like so much begins with the shape of the land and how we identify with it, against it, how we befriend it, or it harasses us, the whole spectrum, and what that does to really like human psychology. So we'll see what it does to Nathan, who's from Indiana, but is ended up in Western North Carolina with his wife. Nathan zipped his Carhartt vest to his chin and reached into the coat closet for his rifle and ammo. He didn't know where he was going. It didn't matter. These hollers were so impossibly maze-like. Even Forest Service guys got turned around sometimes. Outside, he stomped around the house and crossed the yard. He didn't look back. It wasn't long before he started climbing. Their 2-acre lot was mostly slope anyway, and from there, Nathan quickly crossed onto public lands. A Pisgah National Forest boundary marker rusted onto a tree and circled with red spray paint. It reminded him of an exit wound from a bullet. He picked up his pace. Cool air bit at his fingertips. Alert, he scanned the mixed hardwoods for anything out of the ordinary. Occasionally, he looked down, letting his eyes trace the narrow game trail he'd picked up. Flecks of mica glittered atop the soil. He used to find hope in that, the way mica winked at him with promise. But how could someone used to endless Indiana pasture relax surrounded by land like this? Pinholed, creek jammed, ridge after ridge stretching down from high peaks to form a series of cuts deep enough to suggest the whole mountain range had gotten into a bar fight. Time passed, an hour, probably longer. He'd followed contours along the hills surrounding their property, the house dipping in and out of sight as he traced a creek to its source or shimmied under outcroppings. Heading loosely back toward home, Nathan stumbled upon a scar of land open to the sunlight, an anomaly amidst these peaks. The space would make a perfect firing range, and he made note of the surroundings in hopes of finding the spot again later. The wind hissed, and a few territorial squirrels chattered, quarreling over their middens. He considered targeting them, but thought better. He had never believed in killing for its own sake. During officer candidate school, he quickly realized that what a man believed could be far from what a man did. Across the clearing, an old hemlock had fallen across the ridge, its trunk the width of a man resting sideways on his shoulder, as if taking an afternoon nap. Fading sunlight illuminated the back of the decaying tree, its center line stripped to the cambium so that it almost glowed. Nathan loaded his rifle and took aim. The woods sprayed. Echoes of the single shot sang through the hollers below. He loved that, the way the world always felt doubly silent afterward, a sensation strong enough to snap him into clarity before tuning out again. His wife Tenley would have heard that shot and begun to worry. He took his time, loaded another round. Firing without reply was a luxury lost on most civilians. The crack and pause, the power and suspension. If he repeated this action, maybe he could normalize himself. Maybe both Millers, Nathan Millers, the one serving and the one quietly watching, could reconcile and let the silence feel true. He fired again and shouldered the recoil. On the other side of his vision, he saw the Korengal outpost, vivid as reality. There sat Schrouder strapping flea collars around his ankles to keep away the itches. There sat Baby Fat writing his blood type on his combat boots with a black Sharpie. Nathan could even smell the outpost, how piss and sweat and salt stiffened DCUs mixed with the hot air pureeing the musk of war. He loaded and fired another round, felt the silence that followed, braced himself for the interruption. Which flashback would it be this time? Specialist Martin's Humvee, the IED that carved up his fire team like so many sides of beef? Nathan had to carry severed limbs in a plastic bag over his shoulder that day, hand them off at the fob morgue. Afterward, he had retched into the thirsty dirt. So many unexpected indignities, so much gone wrong in the name of something right. Bit more in Afghanistan. Darkness fell back still in Western North Carolina, and Nathan had not left the clearing. He had a vague sense that his house was within a 500-yard radius of the firing range. Following the drainages downhill would get him where he needed to go eventually. It wasn't until the call of a barred owl pulling him from his trance that he actually began to walk. He put his rifle on safety and left the small clearing, bushwhacking through a rhododendron thicket, then following a seasonal drainage until he got oriented. He looked down on his house at the bottom of the holler, its porch light glowing, and realized how long he must have been gone. The forest was completely black. He walked silently across his yard and pushed through the front door. A roasted chicken with lidded side dishes cooled on a set table. But it wasn't his wife, it wasn't Tenley's husband or Sissy, his daughter's father, who ate dinner that night. Nathan watched himself, a fiberglass skin held at arm's length from this untrusted thing within. He studied his wife and child as they chewed their food. He imitated them, forking bits of meat onto his tongue, chewing to the rhythm of 2 syllables in his mind. Mercer, Mercer, a friend of his who had died. It felt as if he were consuming himself bite by bite. Maybe if he called out, maybe if he screamed, Tenley and Sissy would be able to hear Mercer, Mercer. Chicken skin and roasted potatoes slid down his throat. He took another bite. Mercer, Mercer. He promised he wouldn't close off like this anymore. He promised his wife so much. Mercer, Mercer, say it. But each time he tried, his voice curled back on itself, reverberating off a shell in a cacophony of sentiments that meant only one thing. He had to go back to Afghanistan. So there the hollers are harassing him, but they also sort of enable his need to hide and process. So he's like, right about here in my mind, in the Black Mountains in that scene. And I grew up, walking home, seeing Mount Hood and feeling so inspired by how huge it was and the perspective that gave to the pettiness of the bully on the school bus that day. So that, really stayed with me. And then here, when I moved here, it was like, oh my gosh, the leaves fall off trees here. This is unreal. I can walk in these mountains and I can bushwhack in these mountains alone. I'm a pretty skilled hiker. I'm not foolish, and not fear for my life in the same ways that I would never have done that on Mount Hood. So the mountains that had humbled me and surrounded me, all of a sudden here, when the leaves fell off the trees, I could see and navigate, and they became what had been unsafe became a place to sort of claim and get to know my independence and my strength. So I think, I don't really write directly. I've never been to Afghanistan. I'm not obviously a male serving in the National Guard, but there are ways in which my life experiences inform where I put my characters. So hopefully you could hear and see a little bit of that in next.
It's a great story. I enthusiastically encourage everyone to buy a copy of Still Come Home. Even though the short story collection Flashes of War has won a bunch of awards, I love the novel. So you hit on what, to me, before we open it up to questions, comments. Just one last question to Jo Ann, and it's a curveball. Jo Ann, yeah, she's her eyes narrow, and so. Are the mountains of the Tow River, and that's part of the Black Mountains, Silo Knob, one of the highest mountains we have, next to near Mount Mitchell. Are the mountains that you write about here and grew up, the community, in such wonderful detail in the first half of the 20th century as we moved from subsistence farming to a wage earner economy, industrial? large industrial economy. Were the mountains a protective, paradisical place, or were the mountains a prison and something to flee?
I never viewed the mountains as a prison or anything to flee. In fact, I get the opposite feeling when I would be driving home or coming home from I-40 from Raleigh coming up. And there was one spot on that road where I could see the mountains. And I would always have this feeling of I'm coming home. So it's been a comfort to me to be able to live here, surrounded by nature. Sometimes the weather's not very nice, but it's always felt right. And I tried to figure out, is that sort of because I was born here and I breathe the air and I got the right sensations from the chemicals in the air? And am I like a salmon going upstream, going back to where you're born? I don't know. But this always has felt like home. I've lived other places, but they don't feel right.
Anybody have anything to say or ask one of these two wonderful authors? Please. Steph.
How long, not just in the writing, but how long from conception to completion was this book? How long was it in your head before you worked on it? I'm guessing a lot.
So how long from conception of the book to completion of the book?
Probably a decade or more. It was like I had inherited boxes of scrap material and cloth. And I liked this piece and I liked that piece, and I could pick and choose and try to piece them together to make something that fit and was attractive. But it's gone through several iterations, and I was happy to lay it to rest. But it was.
Well, what did you leave out? I mean, is there, I know you left out a lot of material, but what, was there something, in particular that you didn't want to include the subject or a feeling or something?
It was just that there was too much. I couldn't include it all because they were so meticulous. And if I had looked at changes in their diet over time, that would have been one thing that would be interesting. They lived on cornbread, soup, beans, they had a hog, they had a cow. And then later, as food became more available at a store, then they would buy more stuff to make their diet increased or different. But they were totally self-sustaining. But I couldn't put that in the book and have anything left for room.
Well, what are you working on now, Katey?
I am working on a novel that takes place in West Virginia. So it's about how to forgive the unforgivable. I know that much. And it follows two twin brothers. One is a genius and one is not. And then a sort of bully who then becomes the best friend of one of the brothers. It follows, it's actually not in order. My goal was to not write about war and to write out of order. And it's been delightful to follow my imagination in that way. So I'm looking at mountaintop removal and strip mining some. That metaphor, I mean, it's undeniably provocative to me. If I'm already interested in how landscape impacts human culture, and then what happens when you start actually like dismantling it, like physically.
So it may be that the floods of Eastern Kentucky are not only an act of God. There might be an act of man too if we strip vegetation from mountains.
Humankind, I might say. Yeah. Yes. So it looks at that, but in much the same way that like I wouldn't actually say this is about war.
Yeah.
the novel I'm working on now isn't really about strip mining. It's about how to forgive the unforgivable, because these characters also have had secrets in their families that have forced them to negotiate their identities and paths and their lives in ways that were very confounding to them for years. So it's kind of coming to terms with that.
Yes.
Question for Jo Ann. A lot of people have boxes and boxes of manuscripts, can sort of speak from some experience, but they don't necessarily organize them and write a book. I mean, what was it that really made you want to do something? But did you have a goal? I mean, what really pushed you through that decade of really mulling through this?
Let me just repeat the question. A number of people might have a lot of material, but what pushed you particularly to look at that material and say, I've got to do something with it? And what was that journey like?
Well, I enjoyed the stories. I thought they had value, and that they told and helped to explain what had happened in the region to the people who lived here. But I also had a sensitive sense of guilt that if I didn't do anything with these, that they would be lost, and I would be responsible for not having taken care of them and done something to share. Yes.
Yes.
Sometimes guilt moves people equally.
With that in mind, are you going to do anything with the rest of the stuff that you left out?
I have not considered that as a viable alternative. I'll leave that to someone else. I'll give the boxes to my children.
You know, we've talked a lot tonight about the kind of bad stuff, challenging stuff, you know, edge of poverty, sort of lost in a maze of hollers, you know. Fortunately, that passage that Katey read was in the middle of the book. You know, it'd be really bad if it were at the end of the book. It's kind of the middle of the book. So there's a lot of book left, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to read what I call an epiphany, where again, Jo Ann's father is remembering back to when he was 9, and just listen to what goes on in the heart and mind of this kid within 50 yards of the confluence of the North Toe and the South Toe to make the Toe River. One of my most vivid memories goes back to 1918, the 20th of July at 8 p.m. I see myself as a slender 9-year-old boy who had worked all day in the hot sun, hoeing corn in Pa's cornfield, disheveled, completely exhausted, and hungry as a wolf. I filled my stomach almost to the point of bursting with the cornbread and beans that Mama had prepared for the family supper. Completely satiated, I left the table, rubbing my belly that felt as tight as a drumhead, and went outside in the gathering darkness. I sat down to rest under the spreading branches of the cherry tree, and there a feeling came over me such as I had never experienced before or never since. It was as though some sort of mantle fell over me that enabled me to see, hear, smell, and taste things which I had never experienced before. The drabness surrounding me disappeared and was replaced by a sort of ethereal beauty. The little house in which I was born and had lived for 9 years no longer appeared to be just a lodging for the poor and down and out, but in that instant became a refuge, a haven, a place in which one would be safe from all dangers and cares of the world. How did the experiences of this night affect me? It was the first time that I realized how widespread life is on this planet, and that what may appear to be a complete life is actually just a small part of the whole. We are really all akin. The moonbeams, the hooting owl, the sound of the locomotive whistle are all elements that go to make up a segment of the composite whole. All of this happened 81 years ago, but I still recall it in vivid detail, knowing that it could have happened only to a 9-year-old boy, and that its like will never again happen to me. During the passing years, I have tried many times to determine just what it was that was so different that night, so long ago, but it remains only a singular and most pleasant memory. So this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with complex people, true, what's fiction, what's reality, complex people that thanks to these two people, they've preserved and rescued from oblivion or created. So thank you very much. And appreciate y'all for coming.